Hello there, this is Nathan speaking. Welcome to the first N Channel Media podcast. Today we will be talking about Indigenous residential schools. Full disclaimer, this was part of a school assignment. This is not the kind of content you will find on this channel outside of future school assignments, and this channel is never meant for content like this. Similar to how my other channel isn't meant to be dedicated for rants about inferior summer camp programs. Some people still think it is. It's not. Irrelevant to today's podcast, but I thought I would bring it up. Now back to the podcast. Warning, the following podcast contains disturbing details shared by Indigenous residential school survivors. You have been advised. Before I begin, as a side note, as I'm recording this, I've got COVID and I'm trying my best not to cough while recording this. So I hope that I'm speaking loudly enough for you to hear me clearly. I've also modified my audio setup a bit to get rid of that annoying ground loop that plagued my previous recordings. With that out of the way, let us begin. Today we will be talking about the Port Alberni residential school, which has one of the worst cases of physical and sexual abuse out of all the western provinces, including a former supervisor who was sentenced to 11 years for his actions. More on that later. The school originally started out with friendly beginnings, however, that would quickly change when the Presbyterian Church took over the establishment, renaming it to the Alberni Girls' Home in the process. As more students and boys began to attend the school, it was renamed to the Alberni Indian Residential School. In 1917, a fire tore through the building. Reportedly, no one was hurt at the time. However, the building was eventually rebuilt, with the United Church of Canada taking ownership. 20 years later, the building was once again gutted by fire in 1937. Several decades later, it was renamed the Alberni Indian Student Residence and taken over by the Department of Indian Affairs. The reason for this final renaming is because while the school was leading up to its closure in 1973, an increasing number of students were being diverted to the public schooling system, hence why it became a residence for the Indigenous rather than a school. After the school closed, it was repurposed by the government for various other Indigenous programs until it was ceremoniously demolished in 2009. More on that at the end. When the school was first opened, there was a decision made to not include proper bathrooms, with the staff stating that the class of children were best off without modern conveniences, and that they were fine off with bathing in the river even when there was snow. Eventually, with instruction from the church, proper bathrooms were put in. In addition, in the beginning stages of the school, the policy was relatively flexible, allowing some of the children to go home and go on fishing and sealing expeditions with their families, saying it was a way to improve the moral and material life of the reserve and instill Eurocentric beliefs about appropriate gender roles. However, conditions at the school were hostile and unsanitary, and several staff members and many of the children died from various diseases. There are many cases of abuse recorded at the time, notably cases where the children were violently whipped, beaten, and choked. When the Alberni building burned down in 1937, and some of the occupants were moved to the Ahusat Residential School, there were reports that the entirety of the staff at the Alberni Residential School carried straps, as school inspector from the Ahusat Residential School says. Children have come here from Alberni Indian Residential School, where every member of the staff carried a strap. These children have never learned how to work without punishments. In the 20 to 30 years leading up to the school's closure and repurpose, horrible instances of sexual and physical abuse were recorded. Notably, Arthur Henry Plint and Donald Bruce Haddock, both of whom were supervisors in the school. They have both been charged with varying degrees of assault in the late 1990s and early 2000s respectively. While the school tried to keep close relations to the indigenous lands and culture around it, eventually assimilation and segregation would result. Beginning in the 1940s, it was thought that the school's proximity and location was a detriment to assimilating the children, and thus barriers and fences were erected around the institution. There was even an unsuccessful attempt to remove the nearby houses. In addition, there were also considerations to segregate the children depending on which cultural band they came from, primarily the Nuchinals, Seychat, and Hapkasath peoples. The only building that survived both the 1917 and 1937 fires was repurposed as a day school for children who have come from distant reserves. However, by 1950, most of the children moved to the attending local provincially ran elementary school. So far, I've just been touching on the gist of it. Now we're going to get into the specific details of what have been shared on the internet. To begin, we have Joseph Jackman his blog. He discusses about his time as a child at the Port Alberni residential school and shares his worst experience while he was at the school. He said in his blog that he got into a fight with another student and resisted the consequential strapping. He was then punched in the face and had to be taken to the hospital as a result. While at the hospital, he was refused the ability by the school counselor to tell the doctors the truth out of the reason that legal action could be carried out in the school. The moral quote that Joseph Jack wanted to share in his blog is, "Over the years, I've learned that sometimes in life, the most difficult experiences need to be set free." Written by Joseph Jack. The next survivor story is from the New First Nations elder Jim Bob, who also attended Port Alberni residential school. He described his time in the school as hell and expressed surprise as to how he even made it through. He recalls losing a brother and a sister, stating that one was pushed out of the window, and my dear sister, she was pushed down the stairs. He also mentions that many of the students had needles poked to the mouth for speaking their native languages. He even mentioned how one guy was a carver, and how they poked a needle right through his hand. It was also mentioned that this was an everyday, regular occurrence. The final story is from a court report on the horrible and lewd actions that Arthur Henry Plint had forced on the children. It was reported that he had bribed children with chocolate bars to get them to perform oral sex with him, and severely beat the children at night, often while he was drunk. He made a boy perform oral sex on him before handing him a letter from his mother, and the boy was crying all night. How another boy tried to run away and was beaten naked in front of the class to prevent others from trying the same thing. The judge handling the case even quoted that this was the worst case in 45 years this was the worst case in 45 years on the bench, and that the residential schools are institutions of pedophilia. To recap the survivor stories, they just provide more evidence to the carelessness, violence, and assimilation that the children had to endure. It is important that these stories are made to light, as they uncover the horrifying truth of what really happened in these schools. In more recent news, the dormitory building of the residential school was ceremoniously turned down in 2019, in which the building was gradually burned in pieces and windows were smashed by the survivors. Once again, this was a formal and solemn recording for an English 9/Digital Literacy 10 COL assignment, and you won't find any more content like this on the channel outside of school assignments in the future. Signing off.